It started like any other winter in Pinewood Estates, a neat, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood where lawns stayed trimmed to regulation height, mailboxes were identical, and the streets were lined with evenly spaced oak trees planted by the developer 20 years ago. Pinewood was the kind of place where every driveway looked freshly sealed, every car was washed twice a week, and the biggest drama usually came from someone's dog digging in the wrong yard. But beneath that glossy, uniform perfection, there was tension. It wasn't the kind you could see, at least not right away. It was the kind that simmered quietly in the background, fueled by HOA meetings, fines for petty violations, and the iron grip of the board's president, a woman named Margaret Dalton. Margaret had been president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association for nearly 5 years. In that time, she had built herself quite a reputation. To some, she was a protector of order. To others, she was a tyrant. She was known for her obsession with conformity, her endless stream of violation notices, and her love for power hidden behind a polite smile. The residents had long since learned that crossing Margaret came with consequences. Every year, the community transformed during December. Houses sparkled with Christmas lights, inflatable Santas grinned from front lawns, and the entire cul-de-sac smelled like cinnamon and pine needles. It wasn't just decoration, it was a tradition. The Pinewood Christmas Light Walk had been a highlight for over a decade. Families from nearby neighborhoods would drive through, admiring the displays, sometimes even donating to a local charity fund started by the residents themselves. It was wholesome, cheerful, and perfectly harmless. Until that year. The first sign of trouble came in early November. An email went out to all residents from the HOA board. It was long, overly formal, and filled with bureaucratic language, but the core message was chillingly simple. All exterior holiday lighting and decorations are hereby prohibited for the duration of the winter season. Violations will result in fines and potential suspension of community privileges. At first, people thought it was a mistake. No lights? No decorations? It seemed impossible. Residents checked the email twice, 3 times, expecting a follow-up clarification. Maybe it was only for a few houses, or maybe there had been a typo. But no. Within days, Margaret herself confirmed it at a community meeting. She stood at the front of the clubhouse, wearing a perfectly pressed blazer and a pinched expression, explaining that excessive holiday displays were becoming a safety hazard and visual nuisance. The reaction was immediate. Shock, confusion, and disbelief spread across the neighborhood. People whispered to one another, asking if she could even do that. But Margaret had thought ahead. She'd pushed through a small amendment to the HOA bylaws earlier that year, granting the board authority to restrict temporary exterior decor for the purposes of community aesthetic and safety. No one had paid much attention to it at the time. Now, it was the weapon she needed. The first few days after the announcement were quiet. People grumbled privately but didn't act. A few thought maybe they could negotiate, maybe she'd compromise. But then, the first violation letters arrived. One resident, a man named Tom who'd put up a single string of white lights along his porch, was slapped with a $250 fine. Another, a young couple who'd hung a wreath on their door, received a written warning. Margaret meant business. Slowly, the neighborhood's festive spirit dimmed. Houses that were once bright with color now stood dark and bare. Even the community park, where the HOA usually set up a communal tree, stayed empty that year. Pinewood looked dull, lifeless, like the joy had been sucked out of it. But the resentment was growing. It started in whispers between neighbors during evening walks. People exchanged frustrated words over mailboxes and during trash pickup. Small groups began to meet in garages and backyards, away from the prying eyes of the HOA's community patrol. There was talk of pushing back, of doing something, anything, to show Margaret she couldn't dictate everything. One night, a few families gathered at the end of the cul-de-sac. They talked quietly under the dim glow of a street lamp, sipping coffee from thermoses. Someone suggested putting up lights anyway, just to see what would happen. Another mentioned pooling money for legal action. But one resident, an older man named George who had lived there since the development was first built, said something that stuck with everyone. If she wants to ban Christmas, then maybe it's time Christmas comes to her. The idea lingered, half joke, half challenge. Over the next few days, it began to take shape. People started planning in secret. Some exchanged coded messages over group chats with innocent-sounding names like neighborhood updates. Others shared supplies quietly, extra extension cords, decorations, even power generators. It wasn't about breaking the rules just to spite Margaret. It was about taking back the joy she'd stolen from them. By the time December rolled around, Pinewood Estates had split in two. On one side was Margaret and her loyal rule followers, a handful of residents who genuinely believed she was keeping the neighborhood respectable. On the other were the rest, ordinary people who'd had enough of being told what to do with their own homes. The first act of defiance was small. On December 3rd, a single house lit up. It wasn't flashy, just a modest display of soft white lights around the windows. Margaret noticed immediately and sent a violation notice within hours. But the next night, another house joined in. Then two more. By the end of the week, a dozen homes were glowing. Margaret was furious. She stormed through the neighborhood with her clipboard, snapping photos, taking down addresses, and issuing fines. But the more she fought it, the more the residents doubled down. The rebellion had begun, and what started as a few strings of lights would soon grow into something much bigger. Something Margaret could never have imagined. As frost began to form on the lawns and the air turned crisp, Pinewood Estates was about to experience a Christmas no one would ever forget. The rebellion began quietly, almost respectfully, as if the residents of Pinewood were testing the limits of their courage. But by the second week of December, the quiet defiance had turned into something louder, brighter, and impossible to ignore. What had started with a handful of glowing houses now stretched down every street. Lights twinkled from porches, bushes shimmered in rainbow colors, and inflatables began popping up like mushrooms after rain. Santa Clauses, snowmen, reindeer. Even a life-sized Grinch perched proudly on one roof, holding a cardboard sign that read, HOA Who? Word spread quickly beyond Pinewood's gates. Neighbors from adjacent communities drove by to see what all the fuss was about. Some honked in solidarity. Others stopped to take pictures. The Christmas ban had become local gossip, and Pinewood Estates, once known for its order and uniformity, was becoming famous for the very thing its president hated: joyful chaos. Margaret Dalton, however, was not amused. Each morning, she marched through the neighborhood like a general surveying a battlefield. Her clipboard was filled with violation notices, her expression locked in a mask of furious control. She sent out emails, official letters, even called emergency HOA meetings. She warned that anyone refusing to comply would face escalating fines, property liens, and suspension of community privileges. But something strange happened. The more she threatened, the less people cared. It was as if a switch had flipped in the minds of the residents. Years of quiet resentment over mailbox colors, lawn heights, and petty rules had boiled over. The ban on Christmas lights had united them more than any community barbecue ever had. They were no longer just resisting a rule. They were standing up to the idea that one person could dictate how they celebrated, how they lived, how they expressed joy. Behind the scenes, the residents grew more organized. George, the older man whose offhand comment had sparked the movement, became something of a leader. His garage became a makeshift headquarters, a place where neighbors gathered to share updates and plan the next phase. They called themselves the Merry Committee, half in jest, half in pride. They started small but clever. When Margaret ordered power shutoffs to certain decorative outlets, residents began running lights on timers powered by portable generators. When she complained about unauthorized inflatables, they filled their lawns with wooden cutouts instead. When she tried to have police intervene, the responding officers simply shrugged. It wasn't a criminal matter. By mid-December, the rebellion had turned into a full-fledged community movement. Local news outlets caught wind of the story. A small headline appeared in the city paper: HOA bans Christmas lights. Residents fight back. The article was brief but sympathetic, and it did exactly what the residents hoped it would. It caught attention. Soon, people from other neighborhoods began showing up just to see Pinewood's forbidden lights. Cars lined the main street every evening. Parents brought their kids to walk among the glowing houses. A few enterprising teens set up a hot chocolate stand, donating proceeds to a local children's hospital. It wasn't long before someone created a social media page called #Pinewood Christmas Rebellion. The videos posted there, especially clips of Margaret marching furiously through the streets as lights flashed around her, went viral. Within days, the story was everywhere. People across the country were cheering on the Christmas rebels. Pinewood Estates had become an unlikely symbol of small-town defiance. But for the residents, it wasn't about fame. It was about pride. For the first time in years, neighbors who barely knew each other were working together. Families who'd once only waved from across lawns were now stringing lights side by side. The same cul-de-sac that had once been silent after dark now glowed like a winter carnival. Still, beneath the laughter and lights, there was tension. Margaret was not the kind of person who admitted defeat easily. She began collecting evidence, photos, timestamps, even drone footage, to present to the HOA's attorney. Her goal was simple: find a legal loophole to punish every single participant. But her obsession was blinding her to how isolated she'd become. Even members of her own board were growing uneasy. Her vice president quietly resigned. Her secretary stopped responding to her emails. The residents, united and defiant, had turned her power into something hollow. Then came the night that changed everything. It was December 18th, a week before Christmas. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of night when you could see your breath in the glow of streetlights. Most houses were already lit, but that evening, something different was planned. Something bigger than lights or inflatables. As the clock struck 7, every porch light in Pinewood Estates went dark. The neighborhood fell into complete silence and shadow. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. Margaret, sitting in her front window with a steaming mug of tea, smirked. She thought the rebellion was over, that the residents had finally surrendered. Then, all at once, the neighborhood exploded in color. Every house, every tree, every mailbox burst into light simultaneously. Music played through hidden speakers, synchronized with the blinking displays. Carol of the bells echoed through the streets as the lights danced in perfect rhythm. Some roofs projected snowflakes across the pavement. Others spelled out words like JOY and freedom in giant glowing letters. It was breathtaking. Hundreds of people lined the sidewalks, cheering, clapping, some even crying. Strangers hugged. Kids spun in circles, their faces glowing in red and green light. Cars honked in rhythm with the music. The rebellion had reached its peak, and it was beautiful. Margaret stumbled out of her house, red-faced and trembling. She tried shouting over the music, waving her clipboard like a weapon, but no one listened. They were too busy celebrating, too busy reclaiming what she'd taken from them. The moment was caught on dozens of phones. Within hours, videos of the Pinewood Light Show flooded social media. By morning, national outlets were covering it. News anchors called it the town that saved Christmas. But not everyone was celebrating. Margaret, humiliated and furious, began drafting an emergency motion. She would find a way to make them pay, every last one of them. The residents didn't know it yet, but the battle wasn't over. The lights had won the night, but Margaret was about to strike back harder than ever. And when she did, the fight for Pinewood's Christmas spirit would reach its breaking point. By the next morning, Pinewood Estates was no longer just a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a phenomenon. Videos of the synchronized light show had spread across every major social platform overnight. News vans rolled through the front gates, reporters interviewed smiling residents, and local radio stations played clips of the music synced to the glowing houses. For the first time in years, Pinewood was alive, vibrant, full of laughter and pride. Children played in yards while parents strung up even more lights, inspired by the national attention. Donations poured into the neighborhood's charity fund. What had started as a small act of defiance had become a full-blown movement of community unity and joy. But one person wasn't celebrating. Inside her perfectly decorated but dark and undecorated home, Margaret Dalton sat hunched over her dining room table, surrounded by piles of paperwork. Her face was tight with anger and exhaustion. The sound of laughter and music outside made her jaw clench. She had spent 5 years building control over this neighborhood, bending every resident to the rules she enforced so precisely. And now, in just a few weeks, that control had shattered. She refused to let it end that way. Margaret called an emergency HOA board meeting that morning. Only 2 other board members showed up, both clearly uncomfortable, both hesitant to speak. She presented them with a stack of documents: violation notices, photographic evidence, and legal citations. She spoke of reinstating order, of upholding the sanctity of the community charter. Her plan was simple but brutal. Every homeowner who had participated in the display would be fined the maximum allowable amount. Any who refused to pay would face liens on their property. But when she demanded a vote, neither of the board members raised their hands. They avoided her gaze, shuffling awkwardly. One mumbled something about the community's image and the bad press. The other quietly admitted that he, too, had put up a few lights. Margaret stared at them in disbelief, realizing for the first time that she was alone. Her authority, once absolute, was gone. That night, she received a knock on her door. It was George, the older man who had started the rebellion. He wasn't angry, just calm and firm. He handed her a folder containing a petition signed by nearly every homeowner in Pinewood Estates. The document demanded a special election to replace the HOA board in its entirety. It cited a little-known clause in the community bylaws that allowed for a leadership recall if more than 2/3 of residents voted for it. Margaret tried to dismiss it, but the signatures were undeniable. The residents had turned her own rules against her. Over the next week, Pinewood buzzed with anticipation. Ballots were distributed. Meetings were held in driveways and garages. Margaret campaigned desperately, warning of chaos if she were removed, but no one listened. Her credibility was gone, drowned out by the glow of the lights and the laughter of her neighbors. On December 23rd, the votes were counted. Margaret Dalton was officially removed as HOA president. When the announcement was made, cheers erupted throughout the neighborhood. Cars honked, people clapped, and someone even set off a small firework that lit up the night sky. The HOA, now under new leadership, immediately voted to revoke the holiday ban and issue refunds for any fines paid during Margaret's tenure. They also passed a new rule: decorations of any kind, as long as they were safe, would be encouraged, not restricted. The next day, Christmas Eve, the residents decided to celebrate together. For the first time in years, the entire community gathered in the cul-de-sac. Families brought food and drinks, kids sang carols, and someone dressed up as Santa for the children. Even those who had once supported the strict HOA joined in. As night fell, the lights came on one final time. The neighborhood glowed brighter than ever. Every roofline, every tree, every yard alive with color. It wasn't about defiance anymore. It was about unity. Margaret watched from her window, her house still the only dark one on the street. For a long time, she just stood there, listening to the faint sound of laughter and music drifting through the cold winter air. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The fight was over, and she had lost. Not just her position, but the respect of everyone around her. A week later, she quietly sold her house and moved away. Rumor had it she went to live in a condo with a stricter HOA, though no one ever heard from her again. As for Pinewood Estates, the Christmas rebellion became legend. Each year, the community held a festival in honor of that winter, complete with lights, music, and a charity drive that grew larger every season. Visitors came from all over to see the neighborhood that once stood up for Christmas. And at the entrance to Pinewood Estates, right beneath the freshly repainted sign, the new HOA board installed a small plaque that read, "In memory of the year we learned that rules can't stop joy, and that sometimes the brightest lights shine through rebellion." The story of Pinewood Estates spread far beyond its gates. News outlets continued to cover it every December, calling it the modern Christmas miracle of suburbia. A reminder that even in the most controlled communities, the human spirit has a way of breaking through. The rebellion had started as an act of protest, but in the end, it became something greater. A celebration of freedom, unity, and the simple power of refusing to let one person dim the lights for everyone else. And every Christmas after that, as the first snow began to fall, the lights of Pinewood shone just a little brighter, each bulb a tiny symbol of victory over the darkness that once tried to take it away.